Do you ever wonder if the gods are real? I don't. I've met them. Go to the Isles of Dawn sometime. Go see where our species began, a handful of volcanic rocks in the middle of a vast ocean, pounded by the waves, sitting in the shadow of mountains that could rain down fire at any moment. For 1,000,000 years, after the continent where we evolved was drowned by rising seas, that was the only place our ancestors clung on. It's amazing we survived. In fact, you might say it's a miracle. Our ancestors certainly thought so. We don't know what language they spoke or what their culture was. This was in the time before time, many millennia before the first written word. No history, no memory. But we know that they worshipped the gods. When their descendants finally developed ships large enough to cross the ocean and spread out to every corner of the world, they took their gods with them. That's the only explanation that makes sense, because wherever archaeologists look, no matter how far back they go, they find those same figures, even scratched into cave walls on the Isles of Dawn. A few simple yet nevertheless unmistakable lines. They stand on two lower limbs. Their two upper limbs sprout from a single torso, and balanced on top is a round head. If they weren't so familiar, they'd be deeply bizarre, at least to anyone who has the normal 8 limbs, an abdomen, 2 torsos, and an elongated oval of a head. They are our gods, and every evening billions of people across the planet pay them homage as the holy star rises in the east. On a world with 100 different nations and 1,000 different languages and cultures, our religion is the one thing that unites us. Or at least, it used to. Before the scientific age, when we started the question, the wisdom of the ancients. The world is a more secular place these last 200 years, and I always thought that was a good thing. No more superstition holding us back. This is an age of progress. I couldn't even remember the last sunset I stopped and paid my respects. Certainly not since I left for the Scholarium. My parents weren't particularly religious, but they still knelt and said the words, more out of habit than anything else, I suspect. But they still did it. I didn't even mean to stop. I never made a conscious choice to be an atheist. But after I started my studies, there was just so much else to be doing, and almost no one else on campus was religious, and it just seemed a bit silly. Saying thank you to beings whose existence I didn't even believe in. I was a nervous person in my youth. I think partly this was because I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Being a scientist, I approached atheism as an experiment. Once I stopped observing the rituals, I was always waiting to see if something bad would happen to me. It took a while before I'd gathered enough data, as it were, to be confident that I wasn't about to get a smiting. And the hunter raised his spear against the visitors, and in a flash of lightning he was struck down. And the gods said, "Violence begets violence. If you value your own life, value the lives of others." And the people knew this was the truth. Whatever you think about religion's factual basis, you have to admit it makes some good moral points. Sacred verse tends to be short and pithy as well, which is more than I can say of my academic colleagues. When the lightning bolts didn't strike, I started to relax a little. After a few years, I wasn't even visiting a shrine on New Year's Day, let alone every week. Life was going all right, and my career was doing well despite my heathen ways. A few years after getting my journeyman degree, I'd earned the title of ordinary scholar and was well on my way to completing my master's. I'd been hired by a lab researching energetic physics, and the future was looking bright, both for my career and for civilization, because we were looking into a new power source that could, theoretically, run every light bulb on the continent from one room. In the early days, we weren't doing much more than putting X-ray paper next to rock samples and seeing if anything interesting happened. We got a few results worth publishing. Ever since the tainting effect was discovered, researchers had been trying to work out why some rocks seemed to cloud X-ray sensitive paper. The obvious answer was that they were putting out X-rays or a similar form of radiation, but with no power source that would break every law of thermodynamics we knew. But if there really was something there. Well, the implications were mind-boggling. It seems comical now to think how little understanding we had of what we were dealing with. Life kept moving on, and I was hired by a different scholarium to join their radiation research group. I was a member of the team that published the first papers on unstable elements. A junior member, granted, but I was there at the very beginning of nuclear physics. For the first time, we had proof that the atom was not indivisible. Some atoms would spontaneously collapse, splitting into two or more smaller elements and giving off a burst of energy in the process. As far as we could tell, the further you went along the periodic list of elements, the more likely it was to be unstable. It would be a while before we worked out the concept of isotopes. Rocks that were rich with unstable elements gave off varying degrees of radiation as they decayed into more stable components. Then the miracle papers were published. Once upon a time, that would have referred to a new religious text, but these were miracles of science, and they gave us the one thing we'd been missing, an answer to where the energy was coming from. I really wish I could take credit for being in some way connected to the discovery of mass energy equivalents. But I was just as surprised as everyone else when I read it, then read it again. Then finally realized that what it was saying made perfect sense. Mass could be converted to energy and vice versa. When an atom decayed, a small part of the mass was converted to energy. This was what was powering the radiation emissions. The shocking part was just how much energy was tied up in even the smallest particle of mass. Our dreams of powering a city with just a truckload of rocks might be possible after all. I was one of the most respected scientists in the field of nuclear physics by that point, so I was chosen to head up the new nuclear reactor program. The calculations were fiendishly difficult, but we knew that before we even built the reactor, we'd need to refine a huge amount of radioactive material. The cost was mind-boggling. I started off supervising a team of 10, then a department where 10 people who reported to me each had teams of their own. Then I had a whole building full of people I was supposed to be in charge of. Theoreticians and mathematicians and engineers and technicians and, well, I didn't even know what half of them were doing. I just had to keep on top of the reports from my department heads and hope they were keeping track of their own people. And that was just to give us the theory and the equipment to do the refining. For the reactor itself, they gave me an entire town. A small town, but it had its own shops, library, school, even a public swimming pool. A town out in the middle of nowhere, in the desert where no one lived until we built a town from scratch. We knew there'd be dangers. It had been a rush to get the calculations done, and while they'd been double-checked and triple-checked, if there was a mistake somewhere, or if we'd got something about the underlying theory wrong, the consequences could be disastrous. When I'd started my career, we'd blithely handled radioactive rocks with our bare claws. Now we weren't even allowed in the same room as a radiating source without a lead-line suite. If the energy output was larger than expected, we could produce an explosion that would cover several square kilometers with lethal radioactive dust. The weeks leading up to the first reactor test were the most hectic of my life. I wanted to take more time just to quadruple check everything, but I was under a lot of pressure to produce some concrete results. Understandably, given the immense amount of money the project was consuming, but you don't get good science by rushing. Finally, though, I had to concede that I could see no reason why the test shouldn't go ahead. And we'd built the reactor way out in the desert for a reason. It was kilometers away from even our isolated little research town. If the worst came to the worst, we'd only be irradiating a patch of empty sand. I almost prayed last night. At sunset, when the holy star was just visible on the horizon, I stopped and I looked up. But I was on my way to a meeting, and I was already late. And really, what were a couple of words going to do? So I kept walking. When dawn came this morning, I was already at the reactor house. a thick concrete dome housing several hundred kilos of refined radioactive elements, and a big metal chamber which would combine them together and use the heat produced to boil water into steam that would drive a dynamo. Simple in theory, horrendously complicated to put into practice. But we were ready. Or so I told myself. There were 30 people in the reactor house going over the instruments, monitoring the temperature and the pressure and the radiation emissions. All of them people I'd worked with for years, many of them as close to me as family. If something went wrong, well, I'd be the last one out of the building. So either everyone would survive, or I wouldn't be around to mourn the loss. As project leader, I had the honor of activating the injectors. I'd had a short speech prepared, but in the moment, I completely flubbed the first sentence, then decided to go with the much more pithy. Well, here we go. I turned the key, then flipped the switch. One of my colleagues next to me was holding his hand over the almost comically big red deactivation button. That made me feel a little better, at least. There was a mechanical whir as the injector pumps began to send the refined material into the reactor, and it was only a few seconds later that I saw the first bubbles forming in the coolant. The pumps kept working. The reactor temperature started to rise and rise and rise. Threshold. I turned to the electrician and he nodded. We had power generation. Success. After all that effort, all that money, all those years of our lives, we had proof of concept. The nuclear age was here. Unlimited energy. Cheaper than water. Soon, poverty would be a thing of the past, and maybe war along with it. But the temperature was still rising, much faster than our math said it should have been. I ordered the technicians to slow the speed of the injectors, but the temperature still kept on rising. That wasn't what the model predicted. The reactor was supposed to be stable at this level of input, but it was climbing faster and faster towards the red. I barely hesitated. Not waiting for it to actually reach the danger zone, I pushed my colleague out of the way and slammed my hand down on the big red button, turning off power to the injectors and cutting off the input tubes. Or at least, that was what was supposed to happen. The pump stopped at least, but the cutoff valves didn't seal. I turned to the engineers. Everyone was starting to panic now, pressing buttons, pulling fuses. Nothing was working like it was supposed to. Finally, someone suggested that the heat had warped the valves just enough that they couldn't close. They were supposed to be engineered to deal with the heat, but this was more than we'd expected. And maybe, in the rush to get it built, someone had overlooked a component, miscalculated how it would expand. Something. I thought about ordering an evacuation, but the energy levels were so much higher than we'd predicted. If there was an explosion, it would be much bigger than we'd planned for. Not only would there not be time for us to get clear, it might even reach the town, or further. We had to find a way to shut down the reactor, cut off the injection points, and purge the fuel that was already in there. I shouted out orders as fast as I could think, and to their credit, everyone on my team obeyed without question. We all understood the stakes. There was still liquid concrete on site. The project had been so rushed, we'd only just finished sealing the dome. It wasn't a great plan, but with only seconds to think, it was the best I could come up with. I ordered the technicians to put on radiation suits, then drill holes into the injection tubes. A fountain of fuel solution gushed out, and I just had to hope the lead-lined suits would protect them. Then, one by one, they injected liquid concrete into the tubes, sealing them. Just as I was about to breathe a sigh of relief, I realized the temperature in the reactor was still rising, which was impossible. But that hadn't mattered so far. The dynamos were running at over 100% capacity just to vent the steam, and even the coolant that was supposed to regulate the reactor temperature was starting to boil. It wouldn't be long before there wasn't anywhere for the heat to go. A nauseating knot of fear started to swell in my abdomen. I was out of ideas. All our systems had been fried by the heat. There was no way to purge the reactor. We couldn't even drill through it. The heat would boil the technicians before they could get close. This was it. I'd done all I could. I didn't know how extensive the damage would be, but I knew it would be bad. The only thing left to do now was Suddenly the door burst in. I turned, ready to yell at whoever just shown up to get the hell out of here. Then I saw the silhouettes and the shadows cast by the bright morning sunlight across the wall. Holy! I started, then stopped. If ever there was a time not to swear, this was it. I was in the presence of the gods. The white forms were a little bulkier than the icons had prepared me for, but the general shape was unmistakable. 2 legs, 2 arms, a round head. You could have seen the same outline in any shrine on the planet. Of course. I was about to die. The sacred verses didn't say anything about the gods escorting you to the afterlife, but I guess when your death was as spectacular as mine was, about to be, you got the deluxe service. I was going to be the first person in history to die in a nuclear explosion, or one of the first. There was a small clinical part of my brain that wondered whether this was a hallucination brought on by stress. A scientist to the end, at least. But instead of coming for me or any of the other people in the building, they hurried straight for the reactor. They were carrying devices of some sort, almost like a handheld cannon. They pointed them at the reactor and opened fire. Immediately a hole appeared in the top of the reactor, and radioactive fuel started leaking out. I stood there stunned, just completely unable to process what was happening. A second ticked by, and then another. And then I noticed that the temperature was dropping fast. Whatever they'd shot into the core had stopped the reaction entirely. The reactor was still almost hot enough to melt, but the billowing steam told me that there was still some water around it, and there was still coolant in the tubes. The whole apparatus was scrap, of course, but the overload had been stopped. We'd come right up to the edge of disaster and teetered and seen the abyss gaping before us, but we hadn't gone over. Now I breathed a sigh of relief. The gods were herding everyone out of the building, not that people really needed encouragement. The whole reactor house was soaked in radiation. Even a lead-lined suit might not be enough now. Dazed, shocked, we stumbled out into the desert, blinking in the morning sun. 3 gods stood before us. First one person knelt, then another, until even people who'd been vocal atheists for as long as I'd known them were on their knees on the hard, dry earth. I suddenly realized I was the only one still standing. One of the gods said something. It took me a moment for the words to penetrate through the layers of shock. Then I realized they'd asked who was in charge here. I didn't even need to step forward. 30 pairs of eyes automatically turned towards me. All 3 of the gods came up and stood so near I could have reached out and touched them. Then they took off their helmets. I realized I was looking at a face. Not a face like mine or yours, but a face with 2 eyes and a mouth and some more stuff I didn't recognize. The god was wearing a suit, not entirely dissimilar to our radiation gear. The faintest inkling of an idea formed in my mind, but didn't have time to develop because the god asked me a very pertinent question. What, in the name of all that was holy, had we been trying to do here? I answered that this was the experimental nuclear power facility. This seemed to be the right answer because although the god didn't look impressed, he didn't immediately smite me. I realized later that if I had said weapons research, then the result might have been a lot different. Having established that nearly killing myself and all my colleagues had been purely accidental, the god set about explaining some things in a manner not dissimilar to a kindergarten teacher explaining why we don't stick our fingers in the electrical socket. For a start, they told me, we had far too much fissile material, way more than we needed for power generation. They seemed confused why we would think we needed that much, and it was only when I queried the term fissile material that they realized we had no idea what a chain reaction was. So they then had to explain that, and neutrons, and a more developed theory of isotopes. Once they'd laid out the basics of nuclear fission, they moved on to nuclear fusion, which was even further beyond where our theory had been at. Apparently, not only can you generate energy by splitting atoms apart, you can generate even more by fusing them together. And finally, once they'd caught me up on at least a couple of decades worth of advanced physics theory, they were able to explain what would have happened if they hadn't arrived to stop the reaction. The best-case scenario was that the fuel would have melted through the bottom of the reactor, then through the rock beneath it, until it hit the water table and vaporized, spreading a cloud of radioactive material over half the continent. The worst-case scenario was that it would have reached criticality before it hit the water table and exploded. Then the shockwave would have triggered a fission reaction in our stockpiled material, which in this concrete shell would have been directed inwards, back onto the reactor core. We'd essentially built a very large fusion bomb. The detonation resulting from the combined fuel stockpiles would have had enough energy output to vaporize everything within 30 kilometers and spread radioactive material across half the world. And to this I said, "You're not gods, are you?" I don't know why I said it, except that the little seed of an idea that seeing their faces had planted had just then sprouted. As soon as it came out of my mouth, I wished I could take it back, and I flinched a little, in anticipation of the smiting. They didn't seem bothered by this pronouncement at all. Then one of them said, "No, of course we're not. We're humans." And then they explained that long, long ago, by our standards, humans had discovered this world. They sailed amongst the stars, exploring, and when they found a planet where another sentient species lived, they were fascinated. Even as primitive as we were, they found us interesting, so they left a carefully disguised ship in orbit to monitor us. They didn't want to interfere with our lives, they just wanted to watch and learn. They were scientists. Like me, I would say, except they were discovering wonders I could scarcely dream of before my people had even mastered fire. They hadn't meant for us to build a religion around them. They hadn't meant for us to know they were there at all. They didn't want to damage our cultural development. But when the islands our ancestors lived on went into an unusually active volcanic period, and it seemed likely that we would go extinct entirely, they judged that interacting with us would probably be less damaging to us than leaving us to be killed by our volatile environment. They saved our entire species, transporting enough of them to a safe island that the population could persist there until it was safe to take them back to their original homes. Not all of us were willing participants at first, but under the circumstances, the humans just had to do what needed to be done and worry about the consequences later. And when we saw the smoke on the horizon and realized that these powerful beings had been acting in our interests, a religion was born. They thought about telling us not to worship them. But how do you explain a spaceship to a people whose biggest technological achievement is a stone spear point? Going back would probably only do more damage, better just to leave us to forget about them. But on down the millennia, we remembered. And occasionally they had to come back and point us in the right direction, or at least away from apocalyptic danger. They intervened directly less and less after we finally got the rudiments of sailing and started spreading out across the planet enough that we couldn't all be wiped out by one disaster. Although even then, they did occasionally tip the scales in our favor, like releasing a vaccine into our food supply during a particularly bad plague, or using their ship's weapons to break up a megastorm before it tore up half a continent. Very rarely they'd make a visit in person. Occasionally there'd be an accident, a piece of technology would be lost, a ship would crash, something would mean they had to come down to the surface to tidy things up and limit the impact. But our religion was already firmly entrenched by that point, so perhaps they weren't as careful as they might have been to keep themselves hidden, or stop themselves from giving us a lecture when we screwed up. Apparently the prophetess of the ice forest had been quoting one of them entirely verbatim when she said, "Actions speak louder than words." I'd kept that one framed on my wall even after I stopped going to the shrine, which brought up an interesting point. They said they weren't gods, but given that they had in fact done more or less everything the sacred texts said they'd done, didn't that mean that was exactly what they were? By our definition, at least. It was certainly very clear that they'd just now saved us from a disaster of apocalyptic proportions. What would you call a being with the power to save the planet, if not a god? They weren't really interested in discussing theology, though. They wanted to make very sure I understood that we shouldn't be using large quantities of what they called weapons-grade fissile material, and we certainly shouldn't be keeping it all in the same facility. We'd have to clean out the reactor house. The neutron absorbers they'd shot into the reactor was the fastest thing they could rig up in a hurry when their sensors alerted them to the overload. But we'd have to encase the reactor with lead and move all the other fuel out of there. And then go back to the drawing board and get our theory right before we tried again. As they were about to go, one of them left me with a final piece of wisdom, which has been running round and round inside my head for the last few hours. I guess I've got something new to add to the sacred verses. And the God spoke unto the people, who were arrogant and stupid and had almost destroyed themselves. And they said, "Learn to walk before you run." As always, good advice. So now I sit here, holding my fourth drink of the night, reflecting on how the religion I rejected is real, in a sense, at least, and how I came very, very close to destroying the world. I'm going to start praying again. Maybe the gods don't need it, but I do. Before they left, I asked them where they were from. They told me, "You already know. One of us told you where Earth is once, and you remembered all this time." It's kind of touching, really. So when the holy star rises again tomorrow, I'll kneel before it knowing that orbiting around it is the homeworld of the humans. And I'll say the words not because they want our worship, because they don't. But they do deserve our thanks.